In the conventional or the sumo deadlift, what you do before that bar even leaves the floor really dictates what's going to happen for the rest of the movement. And a very common issue is people with weak lockouts. And I chose kind of this topic to touch on because really, for most people, this is going to change a little bit based off of certain people's leverages and mechanics, but for most people, if you have solid position off the floor, it should almost always be harder to break the bar off the floor than it should be at lockout. Lockout is always going to be some form of error when it comes to initial position, which then changes mechanics at lockouts, which I'm going to kind of describe a little bit more detail in a second. So if we get our initial setup right and we're able to produce this deadlift that is harder off the floor and then easier at lockout, most other things are going to kind of fall into place. So while a lot of people just talk about lockout strength, it's much more about positioning, and if we really take care of trying to adjust that strength curve accordingly, the rest of our deadlift really kind of falls into place. All right, so why is it that the position off the floor makes such a difference with our strength at lockout? And what it comes down to is mechanical tension on our primary movers at lockout and putting them in the strongest position. What we're going to get to in a little bit is kind of the main faults and errors people make of kind of why they get into these bad positions off the floor. But really what it comes down to, I'm going to demonstrate in more of a conventional stance. When we get at lockout, if I was to put you in a rack pull position and had you pull from here, almost everyone could pull more in that position than they could pull off the floor. And so you say, okay, well, why when I get to that position do I struggle so much at lockout if I can rack pull from that position? And it all comes down to what your glutes and your hamstrings are doing from the floor to that locked out position. From here, I'm very neutral. I can lock out, I'm utilizing my glutes, hamstrings, and lower back. A muscle is its weakest in its fully shortened or fully lengthened state. It's the strongest in that middle range. So it's just like a bicep curl. We're the weakest at the very bottom. We're going to be the strongest in about mid-range. So we want the same thing for the position of our glutes and hamstrings when we get to lockout. And the typical thing you're seeing when people who struggle at lockout is once they get to lockout, about this point right here, mid-thigh, you can see their glutes and their hamstrings are fully contracted, and really from there, it's just this kind of curling up of the back, and it's all spinal erectors. That final portion of the movement is all lower back, and the glutes and the hamstrings cannot aid in that lockout. So we need to make sure to get those glutes and those hamstrings in an optimal position, so when we get to that mid-thigh above knee, those can aid in the extension of our hips. You could in a sense just hammer your lower back and get super strong lower back strength, and in a sense increase your lockout strength, or you could just improve your position off the floor so that those three prime movers can all work in unison together to lock out rather than getting in this position where it's just a high demand on your spinal erectors to finish the movement. So taking that information, I kind of see there being four main reasons why people end up at this position at lockout, where their hamstrings and their glutes are fully shortened. In essence, their hips are actually extended. They're just at this point where the only thing left is to kind of uncurl that lower back to be able to finish the movement. They can't have those hamstrings and glutes being able to aid in that lockout because they've already finished their job within the deadlift. And those four reasons why really all come back to that initial setup. If we get that initial setup correct, once we get to lockout, everything is going to be in place to be in the optimal positions to help to be able to extend the hips, lock out the hips, and lock out the lower back. Looking at those four reasons, the first one is you never find neutrality within the lower back and the pelvis in the first place when you're setting up for your deadlift. Number two is that as you go to pull and you go to tension in, you tuck your hips and you pull your hips towards the bar. And that's going to create this posterior tilt effect, and the hips are going to rotate under. And when they rotate under, you're shortening and the glutes and the hamstrings and already putting them in a shortened position. It might make it feel easier off the floor, but what's going to happen once you get to lockout is you're going to get that hard sticking point about mid-thigh. Number three is that you don't tension correctly. You don't pull any slack out of the bar, and it's kind of this all of a sudden jerk reaction. So you may have had a good position, but once you kind of jerk the bar, it pulls you out of position. And then lastly is where that bar is lined up over your midfoot. If it's out in front of your midfoot, there's going to be some kind of compensation effect where things are going to have to give to get the bar to come back over your center of gravity, and usually you're going to lose position there. So to really show that, what we're going to do is, first and foremost, I had 3 people that offered up videos of their own deadlifts for critique and review. So we're going to go through and I'm going to kind of highlight things that they could improve upon and where we're seeing these 4 errors that I talked about, and give some detailed feedback there so that you can understand what I said during that with that detailed feedback. And then we're going to come back around and I'm going to show in detail kind of how to fix those errors, how to set up properly, how to tension properly, and everything that's going to help you to solidify that proper setup position to get the most out of your deadlift. All right, first up here, we've got on Instagram, his handle is thequadfather.pl, Kyle. So we're going to take a look at his sumo deadlift here and what's going on. So the first video here is fairly smooth. He locks it out without too much of an issue, but we can already see the kind of the positioning errors that are going to lead to when he gets to a higher load where he's going to get to that high sticking point. Because this is an issue for a lot of people where you're not going to see this until a near max attempt where you're hitting that sticking point. But we can still see those kind of movement faults even at lower loads. So let's take a look at Kyle. We'll go one time through just full speed, looking at the video. So we can see they're not too much of an issue. And let's take a look at the other one real quick, and then we'll break both of them down. You can see on this one, much more of a hard stick at lockout and struggles to kind of get through. So, looking at Kyle, and kind of going back to our 4 main issues, we see here he's not perfectly neutral with the back, but that's within the general reason. Like as he tensions and pulls in, a lot of people will start in this position. Eventually he'll get more neutral. I don't see that as much of his issue. While he could possibly improve upon that, his main issue is, notice how he pulls in is 2 things are going on. One, as he goes, everything is pulling into the bar. What I would typically cue most people is we want to pull more into the floor because that's where we're actually transmitting force. When we're deadlifting, we're driving through the floor with our feet as our upper body is extending up. So it's this kind of counter effect of leveraging that bar against the pressure into the floor. But the main momentum he has here is going forward in the bar, and it kind of comes from that cue. A lot of times, especially on sumo, people try and get the hips close to the bar, which you want to get him close, but without sacrificing position. You can see here as he goes in, he posteriorly tilts and he loses that back position a little bit. Oops, I'm going too far forward. He loses that. He's in this kind of slight flexion with the lower back and then slight posterior tilt. But at this easier load, he's able to finish it no problem. Once we get to this heavier load though, the same thing happens. He pulls towards the bar, the hips go into the bar, he kind of tucks under with the hips and the low back is slightly flexed. And so when he gets to lockout, right here, his glutes and his hamstrings are done. They're fully contracted. They finished their job within the movement. They've extended the hip to their ability. All he has the ability to do here now is to kind of uncurl and extend that back. So he's stuck on that mid-thigh position and he's just trying to use those spinal erectors to just finish out that movement. So the 2 big things I'm going to talk to give feedback and critique for Kyle about is, 1, really thinking about pulling his hips and his feet into the floor and driving into that midfoot and creating this pressure down into the floor to create the opposite reaction up. And 2nd, really slow down how fast he pulls in. Especially with sumo deadlift. I compare sumo deadlift to classical music or a symphony, orchestra, and conventional deadlift to rock and roll. We have one conventional deadlifter we're going to get into a little bit, but a lot of times this issue doesn't affect a conventional deadlifter as much because you can kind of muscle it out. On a sumo deadlift, positioning is so important off the floor. If you don't nail it, you're going to run into issues, and it's very hard to grind through these mid-thigh sticking points with sumo. So you can see here, he has a pretty aggressive pull in. It's pretty fast, and he actually kicks that bar out. That's how much he's cueing this forward movement in the bar as he kicks that bar out, which is getting it forward of his center of gravity. More so, I'm going to cue Kyle to really, one, like I said, drive into the floor with his feet, be directional there. And then two, be a lot more patient as he pulls in so he can be intentional. So he can really make sure to hammer these positions. And if he eventually gets to the point where it's very habitual and he can master controls of these positions, he can speed that kind of pull in up a little bit. But until then, it's a lot more about being patient as he goes into that pull, so he can make sure to maintain that lumbar and pelvic position so that when he gets to lockout, those hamstrings and those glutes can still be in a strong position to help aid. All right, next up, we got another sumo deadlifter. On Instagram, his handle is Dirtavico, and I might butcher this, but Onion. Just give him a little shout out for offering to share this as an example. So first off, we're going to show this front view. This is where we're going to really see this sticking point with Onion. He's going to get to that mid-thigh position and is going to have a really hard stick once he gets there. But since it's a front view, we're going to have a hard time kind of seeing why that is. So he eventually kind of gets the lockout, but competition, that's red lights for a hitch and ramping. So when we get to the side view, even though this is low load, we can already kind of see what's going on. So let's watch this at full speed first. So no problem there since it's low load, but let's watch what happens. So one, I'd almost argue maybe this is a semi-bad habit he's picked up because he's so close to that wall that if he was actually to hinge and kind of reach his hips back, it's almost this feeling of the presence of the wall keeps him away from it. So I'm gonna get him, one, to move away from that wall because we need that room. But two, the last video we saw a decently neutral position, but the pull in was way too into the bar, so he tucked under. Where here, he reaches down to the bar, loses position. We already have this flexed lower back and posteriorly rotated pelvis, and then he keeps that position as he pulls in. So his initial position is already shortened glutes, shortened hamstrings, flexed back. So once he gets to mid-thigh, he's already pretty much shortened those muscles, and it's all low back. So for this situation, it's less about, he does a decent job of pulling into the floor. That could always I think it's probably could be a little bit better, but the majority of the issue here is that original position never finds neutrality. And really, you can see there, if he even tried to reach his hips back as much as he needs to, because he's going to hit that wall. Because what we have to understand is to have that neutral spine and neutral pelvis, there is a certain distance from our shoulders to our hips that genetically we are predispositioned with. We can't change that. We can't change the length of this lever arm at a completely neutral position. People will, in a sense, try to do that partially by maybe letting their thoracic spine give a little bit, which is just a different topic and is a more common practice that's not going to kind of hurt your deadlift as much if you do it correctly. But for the most part, if we want neutrality, there is a certain distance his hips have to be from his shoulder. There is no getting around that. He has a certain torso length. So right here, he's decreasing that effective distance by having this flexion. And so his hips need to be more back here so that he can have neutrality from the hips all the way through the shoulders. And he needs to maintain that as he pulls in. But instead, we can see there, it's that tuck under. And then I'd also lead with we need to find neutrality here, but two, as I'll kind of discuss later, I'm a big fan of allowing your head and your chest to lead position, especially on a sumo deadlift. A lot of people tend to lag behind with their chest and their head, and you can see here, there's a lot more movement coming from the hips and the knees to lower into the bar, and it's not until the very end his chest kind of follows through with. Instead, I'd rather this lead because that's gonna, you don't want to be extended in a deadlift. It's also very hard to be extended. People don't typically have an issue with anterior tilt and extension at the low back on deadlift just because the natural tension of a deadlift is going to pull you more neutral if you try to cue extension. So I would, in this situation, almost cue extension to the fact that he's not going to achieve that. It's more so going to achieve neutrality. And then we need to lead with that head and the chest to make sure we're keeping that head and chest high so that those hips aren't wanting to tuck under here as you pull in. All right, so for the final example here, we have a conventional deadlift. We've got Nick, Instagram handle, Nick Deadlifts. I liked this example because it kind of summarizes the last couple points and shows more of kind of what typically a conventional deadlifter struggles with. Sumo deadlift, I see a lot more of points 1 and 2, which is you don't start in a neutral position, or you tuck your hips in and you pull too much into the bar and create this posterior tilt as you're pulling in. On a conventional deadlift, I see a lot more of that jerking action and more of starting a little bit too much over in front of your midfoot so that bar's center of gravity is forward from you. So let's first take a look at his deadlift at full speed, get an idea for what we have going on. Okay, so we can see here, he doesn't start perfectly neutral, but he actually doesn't do a terrible job of once he pulls in, he then kind of extends and gets a bit more neutral. I'm not going to say that's optimal. It's not what we want to do, but he gets there. But he immediately loses that as he goes to pull because that bar, you can see, I'll lift this up so you can see a little better. Watch right here with what that bar does. That bar's first immediate reaction is to shift back because it's starting too far forward over center of gravity. And so what has to happen is 1, his hips shoot up, but 2, since his hips weren't back far enough because they were forward due to the bar being forward, he now has to, in a sense, kind of like reduce the length from his shoulders to his pelvis to make up for that error because the hips were already right here. The hips aren't going to go back. You saw that. The hips just went straight up, if not even forward a little bit. Since they're not going back to increase that lever arm to make sure that's neutral, then the shoulders have to come back. So that's where you're seeing this flexion here and this rotation of the pelvis under as you see the bar come back. And we see with conventional, like I said, this wasn't a max attempt, but typically you'll see conventional deadlifters able to grind this position out a little bit more. Sumo, a lot of times you'll see that really hard sticking point where on conventional you'll see people to be able to kind of grind this out and kind of uncurl that back position. So a couple things for Nick is 1, we need to start that bar over his midfoot. Right now that bar is almost out over his toes. We need to get that more over his midfoot so it's over his center of gravity. Second, one of the biggest things and errors I see with a lot of conventional deadlifters, and I can usually almost tell immediately by looking at their deadlift, is they don't have a strong understanding of how to hinge. Within a sumo deadlift, that still matters a lot, but since there's a lot less hip flexion, you can get away with not knowing how to hinge correctly. It kind of comes more natural in a sumo deadlift, mainly because most people are thinking more about legs and not as much about hip flexion. It just kind of occurs. Where on a conventional deadlift, it's very obvious if someone is having some dysfunction with their hip hinge. So one of the biggest things I'd immediately have Nick do is he needs to master an RDL, a Romanian deadlift. He needs to master the ability to hinge at the hips because really all a conventional deadlift is an RDL from about that position right there. I mean, most RDLs go about mid-shin. Right here, he is not in a good position for an RDL. So an RDL really is from this position, and then if we're dropping down from that position, it's just a little bit of knee flexion to get that last range of motion. So it's RDL position, a little bit of knee flexion to get that last range of motion. So we need to master that RDL position and that hinge to be able to properly position ourselves. Second, as I mentioned, he starts out kind of flexed over, and as he pulls in, he straightens that back, but to do so, he has to then lower his body, and because he actually has okay tension here with the bar, but to be able to get that back straight, he's going to have to continue. You can see there, he continues to have to lower everything from his shoulders to his hips down to be able to kind of get that neutrality, which then as soon as he pulls, it yanks him right back into that position, not only because of the midfoot issue, but also because he's not tensioned into the bar. There isn't enough weight in his hands already, enough slack pulled out that immediately is going to jerk his upper back and his arms down and kind of create this kind of, a lot of times you'll see almost more with that kind of a thoracic rounding. He's getting more of that mid back to low back rounding because of that, the addition of the bar being in front of the midfoot. So So the biggest things here is one, we're gonna move that bar back a little bit. He's gonna learn how to properly hinge with an RDL. And then when his hips are raised right here, he should have that bar pretty heavy in his hands. I almost kind of call this position here like tensioning into an RDL. Like he should be feeling a lot of tension in his hamstrings, glutes, and back, but he needs to make sure when he's doing that, he's having neutrality in his back to get that kind of position from all the way from those shoulders down to the knees. And then from there, all he's really doing is bending at the knees to then get into position and pull those feet into the floor. You can see here, kind of like the last video, he lags behind with that head as well. So you can see the hips lower, the chest is still facing down, and at the last second, he pulls that chest up. And while on a conventional deadlift, a lot of times you're not going to look as forward or as up, there still needs to be this kind of position of kind of like pulling the chest through the arms, I call it. Cueing kind of the chest through the arms to kind of have this big chest to get that neutrality in the back. So he needs to start that here. Even before he starts pulling in, he needs to already start thinking about how that chest and the head are going to tension and angle forward to create this torso wanting to extend up and back. So that as he pulls in, it's a lot more of the head and the chest leading, and there's a slight knee bend, and a lot less of his hips kind of wanting to tuck under. All right, so I've kind of given you a breakdown of 4 common faults that lead to these issues at lockouts with our initial setup, and also gone through all 3 of those videos from those who want to participate and get some feedback. So let's kind of then go into what I mean by these cues and setup positions and things I discussed. So first and foremost, if you don't know how to do a hinge pattern, a Romanian deadlift, a stiff leg deadlift, a hinge pattern, that is a necessity for understanding how to deadlift. I think one issue with powerlifting and possibly powerlifting coaching is the lack of experience teaching very, very, very low-level general population people how to do the most basic of movements. A lot of times when someone powerlifts, you just take into assumption that they know how to hinge, how to squat, how to generally move, and they don't. And so, I mean, just for myself, I worked as a personal trainer. I've worked as a personal trainer for almost 10 years now. I don't do much of that anymore, but I've taught thousands of people from all different levels of how to squat and hinge, and that is the foundation of where you build off of. I would never take a general population person and teach them how to barbell deadlift if they didn't know how to hinge with a 10-pound kettlebell first. So the same goes for a powerlifter. I'm not going to have a powerlifter start deadlifting if I know they don't know how to hinge first. And so this isn't going to be a video tutorial how to hinge, but just some general ideas of kind of what you can do. So first and foremost, they need to know how to hinge at just such a basic level. So I might grab some very light kettlebell, and they're going to have to display a hinge pattern throughout a full range of motion. And so I will give a couple cues here. So a couple big things that people have mistakes on with the hinge is, one is it is not bending over. It is more, I don't even think necessarily at all about lowering that weight to the floor. I more think about hip movement. My hips are reaching back and then extending back up. Within that, I have to make sure I maintain my midfoot and keep my knees driving down over my midfoot. Because the one mistake people make on RDLs, and powerlifters especially, even though they know kind of how to hinge, is they reach too far back, and you can see my shin goes into a negative angle. I rock back onto my heels, my toes come up. I'm not actually hinging, I'm just rocking back. So a hinge is more of maintaining that slight knee bend, direct, and keeping those knees driving down over the midfoot, and then from there, those hips reach back and return back up. You can also think about sometimes taking that oblique and taking that thigh and pulling those together while maintaining that neutral position throughout. So, if you cannot do that properly, that needs to precede everything else I talk about. And so what I'll have someone do is, one, we'll learn how to do it with a very light weight. 2, we're going to load that up on some kind of secondary deadlift day with some RDLs or maybe even a sumo RDL if we get to that point. And then even from there, if you need continued practice, maybe it's just part of your warm-up where you take a 53-pound kettlebell that's very light and just practice that pattern to ingrain that. So every single time you think about bending down to pick something up, you're hinging, not just bending down. So before we ever touch the bar with our hands, we need to set our feet properly. And that's going to be a little bit different on a conventional deadlift versus a sumo deadlift because our stance is changing. Both ways, no matter what, we need to set that bar over our midfoot. But our midfoot changes based off of our foot angle. I'll kind of describe that in a little bit. If midfoot is a confusing term for you and you don't know exactly how to apply that, make sure to watch my video on foot rooting. Even though that was talking more about the squat, everything in that video has direct relation back to deadlift as well. It's just a bit easier to apply that within a deadlift, but everything I say in that squat video on foot rooting about midfoot position, about foot angle, has direct correlation and relation to what you do with deadlifting as well. But when our feet are directly forward, our midfoot is fairly obvious. It's right where our midfoot is, which is just kind of right in front of our heel, which is, for the most part, kind of right in front of our tibia. For most people, where your shoelaces are is where your midfoot is. So if I'm setting up on a conventional deadlift, the majority of people are going to set up with that bar over their shoelaces. Can that change? Yes. Some people, I might even have that bar a little bit in front of their midfoot. If they're a very long leg lifter who needs a lot of knee flexion to get down in position because they have very long legs, maybe it's a little bit further forward. But we don't want that out over our toes. We need to be within some range of where our midfoot is to be able to be in position to where that bar can maintain center of gravity. When it comes to sumo deadlift, that's a little bit more complicated. And the reason why is when we angle our foot out, that then insists like our midfoot isn't the same position anymore. The reason why is because our effective foot distance is different. If we're just straight, our effective foot difference, or foot distance, is from the back of our heel to the front of our toe. If it's 1 foot, let's say my foot is 1 foot long, that is the effective distance. If I turn my foot out, the effective distance is from the back of my heel, not this here, but the back of my heel in relation to front to back to the front of my toe. So I just now changed my effective distance because of angling my foot out. So now my midfoot changes. And the reason why on sumo deadlift some people have balance issues at the top is if you angle out a lot, that is making the effective distance front to back very, very short. So any minor front to back movement of the toes or back too much on the heels away from the midfoot is going to be very profound versus if our feet are straight, that range of midfoot is a lot farther. So when we angle our toes out, that's going to change where our midfoot is. I can't say that's directly over my shoelaces because now since I've angled it out, my effective distance is lower, so that midfoot in sense is now further back. And so that's why a lot of people will kind of cue set up with your shins on the bar with deadlift. Because if your feet are angled out enough, there's a good chance that bar is going to line up right with where your shins are for the most part. So that's not always going to be the case, but that's where I have most people start. And what you want to be mindful of is one issue a lot of people make when they're setting up their foot position, especially on the sumo deadlift, is they approach the bar one leg at a time with a bent knee. They go like this. And they do that. Go ahead and stand up in that position. You'll notice when you stand up, that bar went from being on your shins to being about 2 inches away from your shins. So you got to be very, it doesn't mean you can't have a slight bend, but I wouldn't do it one leg at a time with jamming that knee forward. You need to be more, I usually would tell most people, start more directly under the bar, and then if you want to, do 1 foot at a time, because then, if I straighten my legs, that bar is only maybe half an inch away from my shins. That's directly over my midfoot. So it's much better to kind of start in that conventional deadlift position, 1 leg at a time, adjust, and then now we're in a much better position to have that bar over our midfoot and kind of centered. So, and kind of using the thought of like the shoelace, where the knots tied, that works on conventional, but on sumo, what you're going to see, if I'm looking at my shoes right now, it's going diagonally through that now. It can't be directly lined up because since that foot is now turned out, it's going to be more going diagonally through it. But more so, I'm going to have most people set up with their shins about a ½ inch away from the bar on sumo deadlift because that's for the most part where your midfoot's going to line up. Okay, so the next part is to actually grab the bar in tension. I'm going to show most of this demonstrating in a conventional pattern because my sumo deadlift is terrible. My hip mobility and ability to get into a sumo deadlift is not pretty. So I'm having a much better job. I'm going to do a much better job of being able to demonstrate how to do this on a conventional deadlift. I'll give a couple demonstrations of sumo as well, but for the most part I'm going to go conventional because really they both apply. A lot of people try and say they're two different movements, and they are. But at the same time, all the same principles for setup and position apply to both in the same manner. It's just that sumo tends to be more important because there's more going on technically with hip to joint movement, or hip to knee joint movement, and tends to be a bit more difficult. So when we get to the bar, I'm set up over my midfoot. From there, I'm going to grab the bar, and at least with conventional, I'm going to think about RDLing down to the bar. I don't want to just bend down to pick up the bar because from there I've already set myself in this flexed over position, posteriorly rotated. And then I've got to fix that. It's much easier just to never have to fix that. So instead, I'm going to just kind of RDL down the bar, and then I can grab it. And even without tension in the bar now, I'm already in a decent position. I'm not in the perfect position, but I'm in a decent position. From there, we need to create what I describe as that RDL tensioned position. So we're going to grab the bar. We're kind of in an RDL stiff leg position. I'm going to then pull that slack out. And since that's only 135 pounds, if I was to really try and tension this, it's going to already start moving without me even trying to pull in. Because I'm trying to already create this kind of hinge extension pattern when it comes to creating tension through those arms, through the upper back, through the lower back, through the glutes and the hamstrings. So I grab that bar, I tension up, I feel here that my head and my chest is trying to travel up, and I can feel the tension of my midfoot driving into the floor to counteract that. Because that's really what's happening. If that floor was squishy, if we did this, we pull ourselves straight into the floor. That floor is hard, so we have the opposite reaction of coming up. So we're going to grab the bar, and start extending our chest and our head up while we feel our midfoot driving in. And when you do that, you should feel an extreme amount of tension already going through that glute and hamstring area. For sumo, that's pretty similar as well. We're going to get in position with our feet. And then from there, the big mistake people make is same thing. They just bend over and grab the bar. And we're already getting into this position of flex lower back and posteriorly rotated pelvis with the shortened glutes and hamstrings. And then we have to try and self-correct at the bottom. A better way to do it is kind of slowly get down the bar. So I kind of think about letting my knees drive out, because if right here, if I was Yuri Belkin, I could probably deadlift right here. He's got the perfect position. That would be the perfect position for me to deadlift. I'm just letting my knees drive out. There's a slight hinge. You can see my hips have to kind of move back, and so I can feel loading all the way through my hamstrings and my glutes. My arms are directly over the bar. From there, I can't touch the bar yet, so then I just do not lowering my hips more, because I don't want to squat down to the bar, because that's kind of where my hips like to be in sense. I'm just letting my knees drive out. I'm over my midfoot. My hips are feeling really solid right here if I can actually pull from here. From here, I'm just going to do a little bit more of a hinge to grab the bar. And you can see there, if I'm going to hinge, my hips have to move back to allow the effective distance from my shoulders to my hips to remain the same. So I hinge back, I grab the bar. From there, I tension up. I could allow my hips to come up more. I can either one, just tension, or I can allow my hips to come up as I tension. But either way, I'm in this sumo RDL position. I'm in a very neutral back, very neutral pelvis, and as I have that bar tension in my hand, I can feel tension going all the way down my glutes and my hamstrings. Alright, so now that we've loaded our posterior chain, it's time to, in a sense, pull in and lift the bar. And we need to understand the mechanics of what we're changing here. So, if I'm down at the bar, I've got tension, my hips are raised to kind of get into this kind of tensioned RDL position. As I pull in, I'm not really changing the tension in my posterior chain, I'm just loading my quadriceps and trying to continue the feet driving through the floor and the extension of my head and chest up to create this distance of where I'm pulling that slack out. So, as you see here, in reality, as I do that, my hip angle does not change. I am at a certain degree of hip flexion right here. When I pull in, doesn't change. I'm not rotating forward, I'm not increasing hip flexion, I'm not decreasing it. All that's happening is I'm bending my knees to get in that position, and if there was a line from my head through my glutes, and you can see that, you would see that is rotating together. As I grab that tension, I'm thinking about my head and my chest leading up, my feet are driving the floor, I'm bending the knees to then meet the bar. Big key here, and you saw this on one of those videos, is we don't want to kick that bar forward. We don't want to shove ourselves into the bar. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to pull ourselves into the floor. Now, is there going to be some forward knee travel? Yes, but that bar is our stopper. Once our shins touch that bar, that's really kind of our sign, okay, that's all you need to do, now pull the bar. So, that's where patience really comes into play. Once you get more comfortable with doing this, maybe you can increase the speed at which you pull in because you have this habitual movement pattern ingrained. But until then, you want to be very patient and intentional with pulling in and using that bar as your stopper. I've got that tension, I pull into the floor as my chest rises, my shins touch the bar, from there I lift. That tells me my perfect position I should be in. If everything else had been right with my midfoot position and my tension, everything leading up to this has been in the right spot, that's going to have me start in the perfect hip position and starting height. That's a lot of times when people are like, where are my hips supposed to start? Are they too high or are they too low? If you had followed these steps, that's going to put you right where you need to be. And the same thing goes for sumo as well. So, we're getting in that same position. We hinge to the bar to grab it. We tension up, and then from there, the only thing different with sumo is we have to then understand our femurs are not in the same angle. Too often, we try and mimic conventional. Conventional, when we pull in, that knee angle goes straight forward. Even though the knees are going forward, my feet and my hips and my center of gravity are going straight down. With sumo, my center of gravity is going straight down to that midfoot, but my knees have to go with the angle of my feet for the most part. I'm usually going to recommend most people are going to set their foot angle in the same direction that the femurs are going to travel based off of their hip mobility and their stance width. So, as I go to pull in, I'm not thinking about knees forward because that's going to drive my knees forward over the bar. It's going to kick the bar forward. It's going to overly load my quads and my adductors, and I'm not going to maintain that posterior chain tension. So, instead what you really have to think is we get down to the bar, hinge, grab, load, and then from there, it's head and chest pull up as the knees drive out. And eventually, you're not going to just drive them straight out. They're going to go forward a little bit as you're doing that, and once they meet the bar, that's where we're going to deadlift from. Any more movement of that knee going forward means our hips are going to sink too low. Once those knees kind of spread out and forward to the point they touch the bar, that's the point at which we're going to pull. I've already alluded to this a bit, but we need to be very patient and intentional as we pull. Too often, especially on the conventional deadlift, people just kind of want to do that rock and roll style, just muscle it up, jerk the bar, versus being very patient and intentional. And on conventional, yeah, you can kind of get away with it sometimes. Sumo, you're not getting away with that. It's going to immediately punish you. But really, for both of them, we need to be very patient and intentional. And as we ingrain those patterns, we can then possibly speed that setup up. But even with that, some keys to notate is one, as I grab this bar, the speed at which I raise my hips to kind of tension in that RDL manner, that doesn't ever need to speed up. Too often I see this. This jerky motion up and then jerky motion back down. That doesn't help you very much. I'm just going to, maybe someone has differing opinions, but I'm going to straight say that does not help you. The rising of the hips to tension should always be very patient and slow, and most people need to pause there for a second. You can see here, I get the tension, I raise my hips up, I pause there for a second, I then pull in. You can see I didn't rush to bring them up, I didn't rush to bring them down. I want to make sure I have that proper tension before coming down. And then from there, maybe at first, I'm very intentional as I pull in, but then maybe I get a lot more experience with this and I feel more comfortable. I'm not going to change this, but I might then pull in faster because then I can get kind of a bit more of a, Even though we don't have an eccentric loading effect like we do on the squat and the bench press and the deadlift, that's kind of how we get that. We kind of get this almost kind of rebound elastic effect as we pull in faster. But that should not be at the expense of losing control and position as we do it. And the same thing goes for the sumo deadlift. We need, and probably even more so, we need to be even more patient, as most people get very little out of kind of that strong, hard whip to pull in on a sumo deadlift. Most people do much better with a more patient pulling position. So, we get in position, hinge down and grab the bar, we raise up, we make sure we have tension, no rush to get down, and from there, very intentional, and then pulling through. So, being very mindful of what you're doing and how you're controlling those positions so you're not losing them. Within that, I've kind of mentioned we want our head and our chest to lead. So let me kind of demonstrate what I mean by that. And it's probably more so important on the sumo deadlift. That's where we really see people struggle with this, is they get in position, they tension up, and then their head and their chest stays down as their hips curl and tuck under. Even though I'm pulling into the floor, I never allowed my torso to extend back to neutral. We have to understand that our torso is one unit, and then our lower body is one unit. They need to move cohesively. So I'm going to, since from here, I'm going to cue, I'm not even going to think as much about my lower body yet. I'm going to cue head and chest to lead as my knees go out. If I do that, the hips are going to lower. There is no way those knees can go out and your head and chest come up without the hips lowering. I just tried to do it there. Maybe it looked awkward, but I can't do it. It's not possible. If your head and your chest come up and your knees drive out, your hips are eventually going to lower into place. And the same thing kind of happens on conventional deadlift to a lesser extent. We're in position, my head and my chest lead, I bend my knees, my hips have to lower. Never once did I think about lowering my hips. I just thought about raising my head and my chest, I thought about bending my knees, and I thought about driving my midfoot into the floor and my hips to the floor versus ever thinking about lowering my hips. And what this all is eventually going to lead to is you deadlifting correctly. If we set up and tension and position correctly, the deadlift comes fairly naturally. What we're trying to do is create this position to where we're loading ourselves to where when we apply full force, it just brings us up into position. The deadlift, I've kind of already described this in its simplest form, is us driving to the floor as we extend everything up. And so I kind of look at the deadlift as a two-part movement. It's a leg press to a hip thrust. That first half of the movement is leg press, leg press, leg press, and then at this point, hip thrust. Same thing with the sumo deadlift. Leg press, leg press, leg press, hip thrust. What you usually see on sumo in particular is the best sumo deadlifters, you'll see this knees lock and then hips lock. It'll kind of be a separate action. On conventional, because of the position of it and how the lifts perform, those things lock more simultaneous, but on a sumo, you'll very much see most high-level lifters have their knees locked a slight second sooner than their hips, and it's because they're finishing that leg press to the floor, and then the last moment of that lift, hip thrust to extend the lockout. Okay, so we've discussed common faults, we discussed how to fix those and how to properly set up for the deadlift. So what are some things you can do outside of just following those general instructions and cues to help perform these better? And I've got three main things. 2 exercise variations, and then 1 is more programming recommendations. So the first one is pause deadlifts. You've probably heard plenty before. Pause deadlifts are going to help your strength off the floor, and they don't really help your strength off the floor. What they do is help to improve your position off the floor. Just like pause squats or like a long pause bench, if you know you have to pause, you tend to not rush into it. Like if you dive bomb your squat, but I tell you you have to pause, you're probably not going to dive bomb anymore. You're going to get down and you're going to slow and decelerate sooner, knowing you have to stop. The same thing happens on the deadlift. If I tell you you have to pause the bar an inch off the floor, while you still need to be somewhat explosive to get that bar moving, you're not going to be zealous in wanting to explode that bar off the floor because you know you have to decelerate. So what a pause deadlift really does, and the reason why it works so well, is that it forces people to be patient. I talked about already, like we have to be patient and intentional as we pull in, and once we nail that with our experience and get much better at it, maybe then we can be a little bit faster. but a pause really forces us to, without us even thinking about it. And so a lot of times I even cue some of my lifters to, when they're doing their regular deadlifts, to do a pause deadlift, just don't pause. Because we notice every single time they do a pause deadlift, it looks really good, positioning's on point, maybe they're even stronger that way. And then once they do a regular deadlift, it all goes to ruin. And the reason is because they didn't change their intention in the movement. When we're pausing, we know we have to stop and then start again. So there is no rush to go too fast. Because you saw there when I went too fast, the bar was wobbling all around, I didn't have good control. So I just naturally started to slow down and be very intentional. So pause deadlifts is a great way to teach and force that patient intention, but we need to know why it's doing that so that we can carry over that patience and intention into our regular deadlift. The next variation that's very beneficial is a tempo eccentric deadlift. And the reason why it's so beneficial is because it will tell you your perfect starting position. So what I mean by this is we're going to do a normal deadlift. And then from here, we're going to do a very slow tempo. And then soft touch. You didn't hear me crash it down. I touched it on the floor like there was a baby sleeping next to me and I didn't want to wake it. I did a very soft touch, and what I would then do, so pretend like I'm deadlifting again, tempo, soft touch, back up. Tempo, soft touch, keep that tension, back up. Right here, that was my perfect starting position. I was eccentrically loading perfectly into position to tell me what that starting position, 1, should look like, and 2, should feel like. If I took a picture of that from the side, that's where my hips should start, that's where my knees should be, that's where my shoulders are in relation to the bar. And the same thing goes for a sumo deadlift. Tempo, soft touch, back up. Tempo, soft touch. Mistake a lot of people make is they get to that last bottom part and they just kind of drop it, but that's the most crucial part, is to maintain that, because if I'm controlling that tempo, especially on like a sumo, I'm not going to drop my hips too low. That would be kind of odd and weird and wouldn't feel good. It's naturally going to get me into the perfect starting position for my general leverages. So this is a great way to kind of train yourself to find that position and to be able to know what that needs to be to continue to replicate that in your regular deadlift. And lastly, for the programming side of things, the biggest key I have is train at an intensity threshold that allows you to maintain position. If at a certain intensity you continually lose position, whether that be from strength or from bad habits of like the thought of, oh, this is heavy, I need to change what I'm doing or try harder, stay below that threshold. I'm going to use an example. If I had a lifter who had a very bad problem that once they got to like 85% plus, they would lose that glute and hamstring position and get to that hard stick lockout position on sumo deadlift. If I had them do a rep set below 85%, their deadlift would project out to like 600 something pounds. But they would continually fail at like 515 to 530 because of that change in position. So literally what we did is we got below that threshold, and then every week for like 5 months, we just added 5 pounds, added 5 pounds, added 5 pounds. And as long as he could maintain position, we added 5 pounds. Sure enough, about 4 or 5 months down the road, I think he hit 580 something in a meet. And because he was able to manage those positions based on the loading. And that slow progression, there's 2 things that possibly happened. Either 1, he adapted and strengthened those positions, or 2, since it was so slow, he never got to this point of where he changed what he did because it was heavier. It's only 5 pounds more. I'll just do what I did last week when it comes to position and intention and patience. And he just slowly progressed to the point where he was able to manage what his true 1 rep max was while maintaining position. Now that's a bit of more of an extreme example, but my point of there is that if there's a very specific intensity threshold where you see that kind of position diminish, train for the most part above that intensity threshold, and then try and slowly build that up so that if it used to be 85%, you're going to train a lot of reps under 85%, and then slowly try and build it up to where you can maintain position at 90%, at 95%, or even 100%. All right, how I want to finish this video is kind of going through some of the athletes I coach that I'm going to use them as examples from some really good habits with their setup and position that I've kind of already talked about with the demonstrations I've done, but really to kind of give more of an in-depth display of how this is kind of playing out within an actual lift, as well as the fact that my sumo deadlift looks terrible, so it's probably better to look at some people who actually can sumo deadlift properly, whereas I can't. So, all right, so first up here, we have Zach. Zach is a sumo deadlifter, so let's watch this at full speed. I don't think most of these are not maximal attempts by any means, but like I've said, you can tell from a sub-max attempt what's going to happen eventually at a maximal attempt, for the most part, when it comes to that kind of glute and hamstring position. Some people kind of have a slight weakness there where they'll lose that position as they lift, but for the most part, we can tell in that initial setup how they're going to react as we get into higher intensity. So here's Zach. Okay, so we can see here, he tensions the bar, he extends up, he has some slight rounding, which at the upper back, which is fine. He's cueing that to an extent, but notice the lower back, the glutes and the hamstrings are all neutral. He has those lined up, especially on the sumo deadlift. It's not the worst thing in the world to have this slight thoracic rounding to create a little bit of a better leverage and kind of like a long arm position. But even with that, as he pulls in, he maintains, and you can see he leads with that head and the chest. That's the first thing really moving before the hips start wanting to come down. And then we can see as a unit, if I could put a line here, if I was all savvy and knew how to do more things with editing, if I put a line right down where his spine is, you would see that moving as one unit as he pulls into the floor. And you can actually see before he even means to, the bar actually starts to leave the floor. And it's because with his lighter weight, he's tensioning so hard into the floor by driving his feet to the floor while trying to bring that head and chest and upper traps towards the ceiling, that the bar actually starts moving before he means to. And then he's in a great position, neutral here, neutral with the glutes and hamstrings, right in that mid-range, so at our strongest position, so that as he comes up and at lockout, everything's working together. All right, next up, conventional deadlift, where we've got Peyton. Let's watch this in real time first. Okay, so we can see here, Peyton has grabbed the bar. He's creating tension. For the most part, we have a neutral back position. Like I said, this doesn't have to be perfect. There just needs to be some form of neutrality there, because neutrality is always a range. There's always a range of flexion to extension, which is acceptable, and this is very much within that range. Then as he goes down, he grabs that bar, he tensions. Actually, there he even more tensions more. He starts to tighten that upper back, and I guarantee if you asked him how he felt, right now he feels a lot of kind of tension in the glutes and the hamstrings as he's loading that posterior chain, because then those feet drive into the floor as his head comes up, and that's where he's loading the quadriceps. That original tensioning was to load the posterior chain. The then pull in is to load those quadriceps. And just like Zach, you're seeing here, that bar actually starts to come off the floor before he even truly means to pull, because it's a lighter weight. And then very easily then comes all the way through lockout as he gets into position. Now, he's not perfectly neutral here, but again, within conventional, it's much easier to grind out this position. And for conventional, I consider that a very, very acceptable range to be right there. That's going to be a very easy range for most people to lock out. And you can see there, he's got long arms. There's not much motion there for him to fully extend. So biggest thing there, I think the thing that if you take away from Peyton, is he does a really good job of pre-tensioning that back from all the way from the traps, all the way through the glutes, all the way through the hamstrings before he then pulls into that bar. All right, we got another conventional deadlift here. We've got Adam. Adam, this is a good example because we're going into a deadlift bar now. We have a couple deadlift bar examples. That's something I wasn't really able to kind of go into detail with since I don't have one, but with a deadlift bar, with both conventional and sumo, it's extremely important to be able to get that slack out of the bar, or else you're going to get punished even more when it comes to that affecting your position when you start to pull. So we'll watch Adam in full time here. This is actually a set of 2, but we'll just watch that first rep. So we can see here, Adam does something a little bit different, but completely fine, is he doesn't do a great job of tensioning right here. Like at this point right here, he is not getting much slack out of the bar, but he is achieving neutrality. We have decently neutral lower back and pelvis. And then from there, he really drives the feet into the floor while extending the chest and the head up. You can see almost, he gets to this point here, and then from there, rather than trying to extend or do anything with the legs, it's really extending with the chest and head up at the back to then get into the right position to where then he can lock out through. So I would call that a little bit more of an advanced technique. I would teach most people to pre-tension that bar a little bit more, but Adam's got that down to where he is able to time it to where he's creating that leverage to be able to then pull. Next up, we got Rob. Let's take a look at Rob in full speed. So, Rob is someone who actually does kind of get stuck near lockout. And you kind of see that there. And he's someone that's probably going to kind of just happen. He's a big dude. He's 300 pounds. When you're a bigger guy, you have less room for hip flexion. So to be actually achieve perfect neutrality is very hard. That's why you see a lot of those super heavyweights kind of do that bar roll technique or have a wider stance, which you can see here he actually does have a wider stance, just to make more room for hip flexion. So it is tough for him. But how he kind of is able to get around this, because you can see right here as he grabs the bar, that's not a great position. Him just naturally getting down to that bar is I don't want to say awkward, but it's hard to achieve neutrality. So what he really has to do is he does a great job of raising those hips. Right here, he is neutral, he is loaded. You can see how much whip he has out of that bar, and he's already tensioning. Like if there was 300 pounds on that bar, it wouldn't be on the floor anymore. It would already be coming off the floor with how much he's putting into that. So he's getting what I call into that RDL position from those arms to that upper back, through the back, glutes and hamstrings, all is very tight and tensioned right now and loaded. And then from there, he pulls in and chest up. Now he does have a slight tendency, you can see here, to pull into the bar, but I do okay with that with him because he kind of uses this kind of like, I don't know if there's a right phrase for it, but it's kind of whip technique. It's a very fast slack pull, and it works for him. And if Jamal Browner is someone that uses this cue, is he says to basically slack pull into a block pull. I think Kaylor Woolham is probably a really good example of that, is he does such a hard slack pull into the bar, he almost pulls the bar into a block pull position, because for someone like Rob, it's going to be much easier for him to pull from a 2 inches off the floor on blocks than it is to pull off the floor. So he's almost trying to explode so hard into the bar that he creates kind of the bar to come up into that block pull position. And you can see here, boom, that's kind of that position he pulls into, it's that natural, like explosive pull that slack pull gets into. And then from there, all he has to do is deadlift from there to the lockout. All right, here we've got Joey. Joey actually doesn't do much of a slack pull, and you'll kind of see that. He does more of just gets in the position and then pulls. So I'll show one more time. You can see he just kind of gets to where he needs to, and then boom, goes. But you can see here, everything is kind of, as he's doing this, everything is kind of rising up. Too often when people do a style like this, where they don't do a slack pull, they more just kind of like shift in position, they tend to want to drop their hips and drop everything down, which is actually something Joey had struggled with in the past. But he's done a really good job lately of really keeping that high hip position and trying, as he kind of rocks back in that position, to keep everything up high. Not letting himself sink down, but keep everything up high, so he's already tensioning that bar. So when he goes to pull, we can see here, I mean, those arms are directly over the bar with the shoulders. He's fairly upright, hips are in a great position, everything's neutral. From there, it's fairly effortless from him to just drive those legs. And then you can see here, he barely has to do anything to lock out. It's just kind of already right there because of how he positioned off the floor. All right. Last, we've got two sumo deadlifters. We got Lorenzo, who is probably my lifter who does the best of tensioning a bar of a stiff bar. He gets a lot out of the stiff bar. And he has some habits here that you're going to see that I might not cue everyone to do, but it works for him. So, and actually this lift, he got a little bit out of position, but you'll still see the kind of the main things we're trying to kind of check mark off as good habits to build off of. So. Okay, so one thing that I wouldn't recommend for everyone, you can see he does a very thoracically rounded position as he pulls that slack out of the bar. Not everyone should do that, but you can see here, look how long-armed he's getting. I mean, you can see, just look at this position. Look at where his shoulders are in relation to his upper back, and then look as he pulls how much they protract to really leverage up and get as much, to reduce range of motion as much as possible. So, but if you look, yes, his upper to mid back is rounded, but his pelvis, hamstrings, and lower back are all neutral and in that mid-range. And so as he goes to pull in, he does a better job of kind of getting that upper back more neutral while still maintaining that very long arm position, so that as he goes to pull, he's able to maintain that. The one issue he had here, you can kind of see it, is the bar was a bit too forward from his midfoot. And so it allowed him to kind of squat down a little bit too much. So his hips got a little bit too low. So we can see here, everything has to kind of shift back before then it comes up. So he got a little bit out of position. That was something we were working on for a long time. But the biggest thing I wanted to show here is look just how much he's allowing those arms to protract and extend to create advantageous leverages. And then as he pulls in, look at that bar. That bar isn't moving at all. That's an Alico, actually, never mind. That Alico plates, but it's a Ohio power bar, so I shouldn't say Alico power bar. He never once, he gets that slack out, he maintains it as he pulls in, and is able to create that as much as possible, that high hip and high chest position. All right, and then lastly is a real good example of slack pulling sumo deadlift on a deadlift bar. So we've got Matt here. It's watching full motion or full speed first. Okay, so what you're going to see here is he's kind of like in a sumo deadlift position, and in that position he already kind of starts to deadlift it. He doesn't actually move it, but he's doing like a mini sumo deadlift to get that tension in his hands so he can hold on to that as he then raises his hips up. You can see on this particular set, he lets it go just a little bit, which actually got him slightly out of position, but there's other times he does a much better job of, like, you can see how much slack he has right at this point. He lets it go a little bit as he raises his hips up, but he's still got a good amount here, so that then as he brings those hips down, he's leading with that head and chest up to get even more slack to then finish the movement. So the biggest thing there, and this is actually how I usually typically deadlift myself, is I typically first do a little mini deadlift to get the slack. And you can see here in full time, it's almost hard to see. Like, it's so quick. But he's doing a little mini deadlift, gets the slack, then raises the hips up to really extend and create tension in that low back, glutes, and hamstrings, and then pulls that head and chest up, bends the knees to load the quads, and then there drives through to lockout. So hopefully those videos kind of gave you a little bit better context of kind of summing up everything we've talked about, looking at the examples of possible movement errors with our initial setup that's going to lead to issues at lockout, going through all the things I discussed when it came to our setup, when it came to exercise selection and things we can do programming wise to help improve our deadlift positioning, and then really seeing those examples there, kind of how that comes to fruition within the movement to create the most efficient lift possible to maximize your strength. So if you have any questions, make sure to comment below. Make sure to subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Like it, share it, pass along the information so we can get everyone deadlifting spectacularly, so everyone's hitting PRs, because that's my goal for everyone. So, all right, have a great day.